Welcome to Finding Home Healing. I'm your host, Sadie. I believe you were born with a light that guides you to your higher self and most passionate life. But for many of us, it's been extinguished or lost. My mission is to help you find your way back home to that light so that you can love deeper, live in your power, and truly thrive. For those lost or lonely souls, welcome home. Hi, Natalie. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. Just for those of the listeners who don't know who you are, would you mind giving us a brief introduction to you, what you do, and why you love to do it?
Yes. Okay. I'm so excited to be on the podcast too. Sadie means so much to me. Talking to also to
Aw.
you. So happy to be here. Okay. So I am a board certified genetic counselor, traditionally trained to offer genetic counseling, which basically just means that I help people understand what's in their DNA and how that can apply to their health. And I started my practice to bring an integrative, holistic, functional, however you want to call it, approach to the space of genetic counseling. And so I really work with patients from, kind of serving all different areas and specialties, including things like disease risk, but also people come to me to see if they can find a root cause of symptoms or diseases or things they're experiencing. Yeah, that's a little bit about what I do.
I love it. I love it so much. I know I was a patient of Natalie's as well, and we might get into this a little bit later, like a case study of my actual genetics, but it was so fascinating to me because I think a lot of people probably hear these words thrown around like your DNA and your genes, and that's genetic, or that's your what is it? Yeah, predisposed
Yeah.
to this, that, and the other, and very much in like the disease world and the illness world. And I just feel like there's a need for people to like actually understand more about what their genetics mean to them and what we can do to not only limit risks that we may have that are kind of out of our control, but to also just understand ourselves in a more holistic way. And I think that you, more than anyone that I've ever known in this world, are so good at that. And we'll get into this a little bit too, how I think that you've kind of gone off the beaten path and trudged your own way. We've had a lot of conversations about that, and I'm so proud of you for doing that because I think that it's so important. So if I'm a layperson and I don't know the first thing really about genetics or what knowing anything about genetics can do for me, what would you tell me?
Yeah, okay. So a lot of people, so just to go back to basic biology 101 quickly,
Yeah, perfect.
um, to break genetics down a little bit. So inside our cells, we have these structures called chromosomes, and chromosomes are basically just packaged up DNA or genetic material. And so when we're stretching out our DNA, we can see segments of that DNA, and those are called genes. And genes are all made up of letters, and they act like instructions for our bodies to do something. That could be, and they also play a role in different stages of our lives sometimes. And so when we're doing genetic testing, what we're actually doing is checking for the spelling of certain genes that we know play a role in our bodies. And what can happen is there can be misspellings or changes in those genes that can lead that gene not to work as well as it could be. And so that's what we're really looking for with genetic testing. I also want to mention too that we all have so many changes in these genes, and that's just part of human diversity. So the type of change and what gene it's in matters. So when we're looking with genetic testing, we're also taking that into account as well. And then I think just beyond that too, another concept that I think people get confused about is something called epigenetics. And so just to briefly touch on that,
Yeah.
try to break it down a little. We're born with certain letters in our genes that can't be changed throughout our lifetime. And that's something that's so amazing about genetic testing is it's actually a one-time test because we're born with this DNA, we're born with this information. It doesn't change the lettering. What can change is the gene expression. And so we have so many genes in our bodies telling our bodies to do certain things all the time. And sometimes we need a gene to be turned on or off. So, like an easy example that I always give for this is we have a gene that codes for melatonin. And melatonin, obviously, is a lot of people know this, makes us sleepy. And so we don't really want that gene to be turned on during the day. And so different environmental things like, sunlight and light from outside can turn off that gene. And so that can make sure that we're not producing melatonin during the day. But that's an example of something that's turned on or off all the time. Whereas some genes are a little bit more complex than that, and there are certain genes that can't be turned on or off. And then also we need to take into account what the spelling of that gene is originally, because that can tell us how much gene expression or epigenetics matters.
Got
So,
it.
anyways, that
Okay.
was a lot.
No, that's perfect. I love that. Okay, so we have genes. All of the genes are a letter combination of some sort, and we're born with them that way. Those letters cannot change, right? I understood
Yeah.
that correctly. But the expression of those letters, aka how our body is interpreting the letters, changes. Am I understanding that
Kind of.
correctly?
That's a good question. So our because the letters won't change, our bodies will always read the lettering the way they're going to read it. So I like to say, like, if you have a chapter in a book and a couple words in that chapter are misspelled, then sometimes the body can't really understand the point of those sentences. And
Mm.
so that will lead to the gene not working as well. So that's what we can see in genetic testing. Epigenetics is more of a process where, as if we were highlighting certain parts of the book, or as if we were crossing out certain parts of the book that can be uh, removed or added. So it's, instead of changing how the body's actually reading the letters, epigenetics is about, are the letters being covered up or not? And so are they
Mm.
going to be read to begin with or not? So
Gotcha.
that's why it's really important to also to know both of those things, because a lot of people are like, well, even if I'm predisposed, then, like some people will say, well, I'm doomed, or other people will say it doesn't matter because lifestyle and my environment controls it. And it's nature and nurture. It's a mix of both. So we need
Mm.
to actually understand both of those worlds to really assess how we can support you best.
Gotcha. Okay. So if in an example, like a specific letter sequence in a gene, what would that be like?
Yeah, so you mean like how it's spelled?
Yeah, like I'm just curious, like I
Yeah.
know that that's like an analogy, but like in the
Okay.
actual world of genetics, like what are
Mhm.
you looking at like as an example? Or I guess we could even
Yeah.
pull up mine now since we've gotten
Yeah.
there so fast. Like what would be an
Yeah.
example of a gene or reading a gene?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we all have two copies of each gene as well. We get one copy from our mom and one from our dad.
Okay.
So we're actually looking at the spelling of both genes when we're doing genetic testing.
Mm.
And genes are actually made up of these four different letters: A, C, G, and T. So it's crazy because even with four different letters, we have like a million combinations.
Yeah, it's
um,
insane.
yeah. And so we're looking for, so we know like how that gene is supposed to be spelled. And then for misspellings, we're looking for things like, okay, at this certain gene, there's to the gene that like works the best, it has an A at this spot,
Hmm.
and this person has a C at this spot. And so our bodies get confused by that. And that could be in one or both copies. That's called heterozygous versus homozygous. And if you have a misspelling like that, then the body may say, okay, we can't really interpret what this is saying. So you may only have one working copy, or you may have two copies that aren't working as well. So then we can support you knowing that information. There's also certain other changes like deletions and duplications, which literally is how it sounds. Like a gene may have missing letters or duplicated letters. And
Mm.
all these different types of changes can give us insight into, like how well that gene is probably working for you.
Got it. Okay. So how did we come up with the lettering that's the best? Like, how do we know what
Yeah.
that is?
I
That's
know
like a
that's
new
such a good
concept that I've
question.
never asked about.
I know that's such a good question. So basically, the way genetics research works is a lot of times it's like huge, it's called genome wide association studies or huge studies where we're just looking at a lot of data from a lot of people and saying, they're healthy, they don't have this, they don't have that, and kind of just assessing from data.
Gotcha.
And that research has kind of exploded from when we just we in the genetics world, genetic testing has been around for a while, but then we sequenced the whole genome, which just basically means we figured out all the different letters in our entire genetic makeup as humans. And that kind of like escalated the genetic testing in genetics world. So we can now understand. But with that being said, it's a good point because sometimes we have variants or changes in genes that we don't have enough research on. And so those are called variants of uncertain or unknown significance, where
Mhm.
sometimes we'll get this back and we'll say, we don't really know if this is part of human diversity or if it's a problem for the gene.
Ah, interesting.
And so when we get those, we'll always talk to patients and say, explain that. And then we have a system where I'll update the patient as we get more research
Hmm.
on where that variant is going, if it's benign or going into, kind of more pathogenic, we say territory.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so it's kind of an ongoing, we definitely don't have all the answers still.
Yeah, I know. It's so fascinating. Like, we know so much as humans and with our technology and how everything has evolved. And it's also like, but how do we know that? Like
I
it's
know.
so
I
interesting
know.
to me. But the fact that we've sequenced the whole genome, so now we know in a broad sense that we have the letter sequencing that would show up for a healthy person without a problem in every specific gene orientation, right? Am I understand? I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm like repeating that back
Yeah.
properly, but I'm like, that's like
No,
what
you're
I'm
doing
hearing.
great.
So I'm like, is that right?
I know. Yeah.
But please correct me if I'm not right in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, with that being said, we have, even though we have the letters, we still don't have all the answers of if those letters are going well or not. Like we're still discovering genes all the time, but we have identified hundreds and thousands of genes that we do know.
Hmm.
Um, we do know, okay, this is what they do in the body. This happens if this is misspelled. But things are always added on too. It's really fascinating. So, that's one part of my job is literally just staying up to date with the research. Even genes that even though we knew the spelling, we didn't know the role. So, we have to kind of stay up to date too, like, oh, there's a new gene we need to start paying attention to for this condition or disease. So it's really, it just keeps my job
Interesting.
exciting. Yeah.
Very exciting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's such a like up and coming thing that we're learning about more and more every day. So I can imagine that that feels very exciting.
Yeah.
Is there ever a situation where you find a letter in somebody's gene and it's the missing letter and it's so profoundly impactful to their health that it's like hard to deliver that information to them?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just like flashing to a patient that I am actually seeing this week, but that happens all the time. And unfortunately, um, people, even though genetics is becoming, there's more awareness around it. Um, there's people don't really get referred to me until things happen sometimes. So, that's one thing I also just want to mention is like I really when I was well, I know we'll get into this a little, but I remember when I was working at the hospital, I remember thinking genetics is actually such a key for root cause medicine, personalized medicine, and being proactive rather than reactive.
Right.
And the healthcare system was so set up for one size fits all, being reactive and treating symptoms. And I was like, but genetics is about treating the individual, not the illness. So I remember having this confused, being confused about this disconnect. And so, anyways, I think that's just because we're talking so high level about genetics, just to bring it down to, I think that's such an important piece of genetics really allows us to find out like root cause of symptoms a lot of times. It helps us be preventative and proactive and helps us be personalized. So it's just like such a powerful tool.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a full kit.
yeah, the three P's I say.
Nice.
Um, but so for instance, I think this is an extreme example. I work with a lot of patients who don't have this as an extreme of an example. But I had a patient who was referred to me because he unfortunately had sudden cardiac arrest at 52. And then we did genetic testing, and we found out that he actually has a gene change that leads to increased risk of sudden cardiac arrest and cardiomyopathy, it's called. And so, that's just an example. It's so helpful for us to know that though, because now he can get the appropriate treatment management. And then also from a integrative perspective, he can, really tailor his lifestyle and his diet to be preventative against having another sudden cardiac arrest, attack. But the goal really would have been to test him before that happened because that could have been avoided.
Right.
But it's just one of those situations where he now feels like so excited that he found an answer because they were so confused why this happened, really worried, about this happening again. And now we have like such a direct understanding so that he can like use that knowledge.
So just the fact that he has what did you call it? A gene change? Is that what, like
Yeah,
when the
or
letter's different?
yeah, we say variant or mutation.
Okay, yeah.
Also.
Okay, so because he had that, that explains why this happened to him, and also him getting to know that he's at higher risk genetically, so he needs to take it seriously to take care of himself and do all of the other preventative measures from here on out.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, exercise wise, choosing activities that relate more to low intensity, like swimming, or running, or walking rather than like sprinting, and doing things like making sure he's getting his minerals and magnesium and potassium in, like all of these heart health activities.
Hmm.
Um, and, of course, there's also, screenings and things that, we talk about from the more traditional Western world that can be beneficial to him. But yeah, just kind of giving him this plan.
Okay, gotcha. And what you're talking about there, is that what you were referring to as like being off the beaten path? I mean, we can go there now that like I think that we kind of have a pretty clear understanding of genetics and what genetic counseling is. I mean, I definitely have like a plethora of questions and I'll probably keep asking them as I continue to keep learning more and more. And
Yeah.
but the oh, actually, before we go there, I did have a question about the expression part and how you're talking about epigenetics and the expression. I don't know that I fully understand exactly what that means. So are you saying that like the environment can change what we're expressing through our genes, even though the gene itself doesn't change?
Yeah, okay. So I think something that I should talk about that also helps people understand this, because this isn't really talked about at all, is
Mhm.
this concept called genetic penetrance, which is a very genetics nerd term.
Okay, love it.
But penetrance basically means that the likelihood to have a condition or disease with a certain genetic variant or change. And so there are certain high penetrance genetic conditions. And those are things like Down syndrome, for example, where we know that having those changes in that gene will lead to a diagnosis of Down syndrome. Even if the person is changing their environment, they're going to have a diagnosis of Down syndrome.
Mhm.
Um, Another example is cystic fibrosis or, Tay-Sachs disease, like a lot of these like genetic conditions, but also high penetrance falls, or other genes that fall into that category are high risk cancer genes like BRCA1 and 2, the BRCA genes, or other disease risk genes that increase risk more. It's not 100% likely, but it's going to increase risk more than maybe some other genes. And
Mhm.
then there are low penetrance genes. So low penetrance genes are basically if you have changes in them individually, they're going to have a minor impact. But when we look at them collectively, we can kind of see patterns. And with low penetrance genetics as well, that is really where those are really the expression changes based on our environment. So an example is the genes that fall into the inflammation pathway. So we know that when we eat anti-inflammatory foods, omega-3s, sulforaphane, these can shut down the inflammatory genes because we have genes that lead to inflammation. Of course, like inflammation can be beneficial for us sometimes with sickness, and they play a role.
Hmm.
But by eating that way, of course, we don't want chronic inflammation. So, like when we eat those things, it can shut off those genes in the inflammatory pathway. And then if we eat something inflammatory, it can turn on those genes. And
Gotcha.
so there's that concept. And so sometimes what happens is people are born with an increased likelihood for their inflammatory genes to always be on.
Mm.
So we know that we need to really help them with an anti-inflammatory diet and lifestyle to turn those off. So
Ah,
does that make more
gotcha.
sense?
Yes, yes. Okay, I think
Okay.
that's helping. So things, when we talk about environmental things, we're talking about food, we're talking about water, we're talking about exercise, we're talking about even like sunlight exposure and light exposure in general, because like you know how much I'm against blue light now,
Yeah.
which I should
Yeah.
actually put my blue light glasses on. I'll do that
Yeah.
right now. Sometimes they give me a headache. It's weird. But okay. And taking things like your minerals and the vitamins and all of those good things, like those are the environmental stuff that we're talking about that will turn a gene on or off.
Yeah, exactly. Even like toxins and chemicals are actually environmental exposures.
Totally.
There's everything from like anything you can think of that can hit hit your body from the outside or internal when you absorb it, which is pretty much everything you come in
Yeah.
contact.
Yeah,
And
I'm
like
like,
even
well, that's literally everything.
yeah, I mean, you can get really, like down the rabbit hole with it where energetic states, I mean, if you're, that's where like it becomes really interesting because dopamine, serotonin genes like can be turned on or off, and expression can change when, you're anxious or, you're in different mental states. So anything that can really impact you is like, can change your genetics, which is like really,
Interesting. Ooh, okay. So that's kind of like a rabbit hole that I want to go down about. I feel like, I mean, in my line of work, I need to take these off for a second, but in my line of work, I'm always thinking about somebody's neurotransmitters, their dopamine, their serotonin, and oxytocin, all those good things. And I obviously don't know as much about the genetic component, but I know about like the mental, emotional, energetic, spiritual component and how things that we're experiencing, triggers we have, or potential beliefs that we have, or wounds that we have, are going to impact our neurology and our brain chemistry. So, from a genetic perspective, what could we do, or how would you explain how to understand our like neurotransmitter balance and what we can do to continue supporting that from a genetic perspective?
definitely, yeah. So psych genetics is also much less black and white than things like cancer genetics or like the cardiomyopathy gene I was referencing.
Right.
But also fascinating and I love it. So
Yeah, and I feel like that's maybe not as talked about as much because
yeah,
I don't know if it's like a woo-woo part of the genetic community or like there's specific people that
yeah,
need to like be interested in it, but I just feel like it's not talked about
yeah.
as much.
I honestly will say that I think it's because like don't come at me, but I really feel like the healthcare system and like the way that Western traditional science is that we really, or no, I wouldn't say we anymore. The system really wants black and white answers. And so when research is, kind of in the middle or leaning one way, but it's not yet black and white per se,
Hmm.
then people get scared of it, I think. And it's kind of one of those things where because you can't fully understand it, then people in the healthcare space don't even want to address it. And then it becomes woo-woo, which is like so
Totally.
funny.
It's just like a category that things get put into that like we don't understand that and we don't care to understand it, so we're just putting it over there and shunting it.
Yeah, and they're like, yeah, exactly. It's yeah. But so the way that I like to talk about it with people is So we have identified certain genes that do relate to dopamine, serotonin, GABA, adrenaline, for example. So, for example, the dopamine receptors, so I test for this with patients, and
Hmm.
if you're born with having variants in those genes, you could have a little bit of a higher likelihood of having some imbalance. Sometimes I'll see patients where all of their dopamine receptors are off, and so we know, okay, they're maybe predisposed to having dopamine imbalance. So that can be really helpful for us because then we can really target, okay, like how can we help balance your dopamine? But what also is another layer that I think is makes it less black and white and more complex is there's lots of genes that work together, and so many genetic components that work with mental state and control dopamine and all of that, including like, we know the gut brain axis now, and so
Hmm.
many other genes that play a role. And then also we know that these are really controlled by our environment. So like early life stress can lead to alteration of expression in these genes and or neurodevelopment in childhood. So there's those things. We know also as adults, exercise, diet, social interaction, stress, aging, like these can all lead to changes. So sometimes I like to say that predisposition leads to heightened anxiety, or sorry, predispositions lead to heightened sensitivity to environmental influences.
Whoa, hang on one second. Say that all again. Say that
Okay.
one more time.
Okay. Predispositions lead to heightened sensitivity to environmental influences.
Ah, okay, okay, okay. So basically, if you have certain experiences, you might be more sensitive to an environmental trigger.
You
Sort
mean
of.
certain predispositions?
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I
Yeah,
meant.
exactly. Yeah. So it basically what that translates to is predispositions can lead to heightened sensitivity of our outside world, which
Mm-hmm.
which I obviously, now working with you, I view as a gift. So many people, but it can really help us understand, what were you born with, and like how can we kind of get even more personalized with,
Right.
you know, assessing what could be going on.
Yeah, kind of like, okay, if I'm born with this formula or this recipe that makes me me, how can I use it to my advantage and not to my disadvantage?
Exactly. And I think that's what's so amazing about psych genetics is most of the time, because it's not black and white, meaning there's not one gene that's going to give you a diagnosis of a psych condition because many work together.
Hmm.
Because of that, we also know that the outside world, like I was saying, really impacts it.
Right.
And so, being able to like, I think do such a good job on this is not really is shifting the perspective of it being a challenge to, it being a gift that comes with qualities like empathy and heightened intuition and, ability to connect with others. And if we're able to really just work with that, instead of, it doesn't mean that you're like doomed to have a diagnosis. If you really just work with, all of that information, I think that's also like what's so powerful about it is because we can do that. And like it is a way to feel empowered through your genetics. The way that I counsel with patients is I never make them feel like they're doomed or they have this thing that they can, that they're like never going to be able to do anything about. There's like
Mm.
so many ways that really this knowledge is about empowering you. If that
Yes,
makes sense.
yes, I love that. We're the same in that way. I deeply appreciate that approach and that perspective. And I feel like I don't know the people in your profession, but I feel like that should be the approach to it because, like, this is data and information. We're not meant to take data and information to belittle us or make us feel weaker or worse, because then mentally, emotionally, if we have that belief about ourselves, then we'll probably end up experiencing it at some point. So taking the powerful empowerment approach, I think, is so healthy on literally so many levels. And then, like you said, words are in your environment and they impact you. So it could turn off a gene that
Yeah,
would maybe
exactly.
otherwise cause you harm.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think, and then also I know we were kind of chatting about this a little bit. So just something I wanted to clarify too is, there are, so I feel like a lot of people are talking about autism spectrum disorder lately.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about like the highly sensitive person and autism and all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So, again, similar to all psych conditions, most of the time autism can be, or is, can be caused by a mix of genes and environmental influences. I do want to mention though that something with autism is that it has been linked to other genetic conditions. So sometimes this is, these are rarer conditions, but sometimes people have something called like Rett syndrome or Fragile X syndrome, and these are actually genetic conditions. So that actually is like a genetic change that leads to like it's more black and white that can give a diagnosis of autism, but autism in general, is more most of the time a mix of genetic factors. But the diagnosis process of autism is really distinct in that it really, even though there's a lot of overlap in psych genetics and psych in general, like autism have overlap with OCD and ADHD and and highly sensitivity with all of those as well.
Mhm.
But with autism, I would say most of the time it's really about repetitive behaviors and social challenges, and those are going to be like distinct genes outside of some other genes that may contribute to anxiety as well, if that makes sense.
Okay. So is what you're saying that autism would have very specific genes that other conditions wouldn't have?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So like if you were to try, let's just take an example. If you were to have a person who just has like generalized anxiety and a person who has autism,
Yeah.
their genes would be different in
Yeah.
their expression and in what they were born with.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting because I feel like, I mean, in the work that I do, right, I have acknowledged that I'm a highly sensitive person and I work with a lot of highly sensitive people, and that has been found to be genetic, but it's like that gray area with what you're talking about with psych genetics, where it's like we don't have the black and white, like this is the specific targeted gene that makes you highly sensitive or that makes you have autism. It's like we're trying to answer a question that's like inappropriate for us to try to answer at this moment in time, but there's a combination of or there's a combination of genes and a combination of predispositions and a combination of expressions and a combination of lifestyle stuff that all makes up a picture of that experience. Do I understand that correctly?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if like let's say somebody didn't know they were a highly sensitive person and they thought they had autism, would there be a way, I mean, I know this is kind of just contradicting exactly what I just reflected back to you, but would there be a way to decipher or determine the difference between those two people or not really?
I know that's so hard. From like a genetics standpoint, sometimes,
Yeah, the gray
sorry,
area. Yeah.
sometimes. So like we can definitely run genetic tests to see if there's something we find that, can help differentiate. Other times it kind of goes down to clinical diagnosis. So, getting really specific with thought patterns and behaviors.
Mm,
Um, Sometimes also thinking about developmental history. So we actually know now that autism is more likely to occur with advanced paternal age, which I find really interesting. So like if a man is much older, usually over 50, and has a child, that child will have a higher likelihood of having autism, and it has to do with the DNA in the sperm and this whole thing. But
wow.
I
Oh,
found
that's interesting.
yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of times people think that advanced maternal age, women over 35 are, there's all
Risk
this,
factors. Yeah.
yeah, risk factors. But now we identified like there is a component of advanced paternal age. And then there's also really interesting research about women being pregnant and having birth complications that can lead to development of the brain and having issues with development of the brain and leading to autism. So all these like questions can come into play too, to assess, but I
Hmm.
think from a genetic standpoint, like you said, I think, it's sometimes we can get a clear answer, but most of the time we're looking at kind of, we're taking into account the information and it's helpful, like puzzle pieces, but it's not as yes or no.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I can imagine people that have, reached out to me or have commented on some of my highly sensitive people content. Like, how do you know that this isn't just autism? And how do you know that you're not just autistic? And um, even though, I mean, I think that's what makes it complicated, right? Is that it's just kind of just a big soup of we're all still learning together and
Yeah.
failing forward with everything. But
Mhm.
to your point, I think the behaviors are really indicative of what's different and potentially the internal thought process and like you said, like repetitive behaviors.
Mhm.
I've learned from some people that autism is very linked to like vaccine injury and to other environmental factors. Like, what's your
Yeah.
opinion on how much the environment can impact somebody's development of that?
I know. I think that's such a good question. I mean, I would just say that environment plays a big role in all of psych conditions.
Yeah.
And so, I would say that I don't think it's discussed enough as it should, but I would say, that it definitely plays a role. There's a lot of factors, and we can, and you can like, review that. I sometimes talk about that with patients too.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I would say it plays more of a role than is discussed in all psych, um, psych conditions. But it's one of those things too. I mean, we can't like forget about genetics because we do see it running in families. So it's definitely
Like a
kind of a
mix. It's kind of like
mix.
what you were talking about in the very beginning. Like there's nature and nurture. You just can't get around that. Like they both
Yeah,
play off of each other and impact each other. It's kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg. We don't
yeah,
know. Like nature happens
yeah,
and nurture happens at the same time because to your
yeah,
point, the impact of the age of the father could automatically impact that future person before it's
yeah,
even conceived.
yeah,
Right? And then
exactly.
all the things it's exposed to from its mother in the womb and all of the processes that develop it and then its birth, like all of those are impacting the genetic like creation of the being.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we're getting better about understanding that. I mean, this is also taking my mind to, I think our mind in genetics, a lot of times. So I'll kind of shifting to cancer really quick. When
Yeah.
people, so when people or when individuals have mutations or changes in the BRCA genes, they're at increased risk for breast, ovarian, pancreatic, prostate. We know that. But how much of an increased risk are they at? And I remember being at the hospital and seeing patients and giving them risk information. And sometimes the patient would never develop cancer, even though she had this risk. And other times, patients would develop cancer very early. So beyond just what they're exposed to, there's all the other genes contributing, right? So like even though they're at increased risk, like that is where I find it really cool with doing kind of more of the low penetrance systems biology approach to genetics of like looking at inflammation, detoxification, oxidative stress, like other pathways, because if patients have like amazing pathways, in other genes, then they're going to be at lower risk. So we're kind of we're kind of understanding how other genes in the body also contribute. So it's like this ongoing kind of, I think it's so amazing now because I get to be like a detective and I'm like, okay, what can we find, and really like understand your body in so much depth. So
Yes, I know. I get that puzzle piece analogy that you were
yeah,
talking about before, where it's like this, it's showing up, but if we have these, and these over here, then it's not going to make this one be as high risk. And,
yeah,
you can also, I think that you are using that to your advantage to empower your patients so that they are not feeling the doom and gloom that maybe another person
yeah,
would tell them, like, oh, well, you have this gene, you're effed, sorry, see you later.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I find so interesting too, is because like the way we're traditionally trained is that um, you kind of give risk information for, let's just say we're giving women risk information about their cancer risk, and then we will talk about increased screening or surgeries to reduce that or be proactive. So, a lot of times, of course, like surgeries, like removing, it's called a bilateral mastectomy, like removing your breasts, that obviously gets rid of cancer risk because you don't have, the tissue there.
Mhm.
And then screenings can catch cancer early. But I remember thinking, well, what about all the other factors that we know contribute to cancer risk that we're not talking about? Like, it's
Right.
not just surgery as a way to decrease risk. We know in research, I mean, the basics, we even know, like, that we've accepted even in the healthcare system, like alcohol, smoking, sedentary lifestyle, like we know risk factors can
Mhm.
contribute, but it's just not being talked about in when we're giving risk information. So I remember kind of thinking like, well, we should also be talking about the whole person and how they can reduce their risk in so many other ways. And then also all the genes that relate to all those, like can we look at their inflammatory pathway and see if they need support there? So anyways, yeah, there's so much more that I think you can get and
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Oh my God, so much. So I'm curious, like if you were to see a patient that had a risk factor for cancer, let's say, and you were looking at all the other things, what kind of tips, I guess, would you give them, or what would all those other things be that they could use to, for lack of a better term, like counterbalance that risk in their
Yeah.
gene?
Yeah, I always like looking at, so of course, we can talk about increased screening, even, ultrasound is included in there, like different modalities with being proactive. But then, nutrition, lifestyle, supplementation are three big categories that, you have control over that can give you a lot of power over your cancer risk.
Hmm.
I always tell my patients too, like there are times when cancer happens, it's no one's fault. So I always tell my patients, like we can control what we can control and then, let go of what we can't. And that's really where like being proactive with screenings come in
Hmm.
as kind of a safety net. But with the other three buckets, I mean, like helping someone, I usually really like to run another genetic test, which is the test I did with you, Sadie, which helps us clarify how we can get really specific with diet, lifestyle, and supplements. But there are a lot of things we know that we can reduce risk. So also, like we know chemicals and toxins in the environment can increase risk. So we want to think about removing that because if you're at increased risk of breast cancer, for instance, you obviously want to remove the things that cause cancer to begin with,
Right.
which isn't
Right.
discussed ever.
Yeah. Which blows my
So,
mind. It's like if you're putting
yeah,
corn in your car's not going to work. If you're putting
yeah,
like cancer pro things in your body or being exposed to them, you're probably
yeah.
going to get cancer.
So it's kind of like how can we address home environment and your environment in general? Of course, we can't be perfect. So then how can we address detox and, ways to reduce oxidative stress because, we know things are in the environment outside. So how can we get rid of them? Of course, like diet, helping people understand whole foods, processed foods, microplastics, like we know these things can contribute to all of that, of course, stress.
Mhm.
Um, and then you can get even really specific too. Like I love getting really down the rabbit hole with like sauna use, and obviously
Yeah.
because you're in the space
I
too.
know, I love it. Saunaing, detoxing, cold
Yeah,
plunging, blue
yeah,
light blocking, being in the
yeah,
sun.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So all of those things, and helping people. And sometimes I'll have patients that come to me at a totally different phase, like they're eating fast food every day and like not getting good sleep and stress. So, we'll always like start slow. I'm not going to jump into,
Right.
like I think it's important for people to start just incorporating balance and start slow.
Hmm.
But it's so like it's such a passion of mine to help those people because if they just went through kind of the traditional system, they would have done the same thing lifestyle they're doing and then just gotten screenings and a lot of times people don't want to do surgery, so then they're just kind of setting themselves up for like at least we have screenings when it does come up and it's like no, there's so much more we can do. So
Yeah, is that how a genetic counselor, like at a hospital, like where you used to work, is that what you would do for patients? You wouldn't those people, those genetic counselors aren't telling these people that they can eat better and move their butt around and do different
Yeah.
stuff. Like they're just telling them like, oh, we can get screenings and that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, that's usually how we're trained. I know that some, some genetic counselors don't feel like comfortable talking about it, but I always say, it's so it's so essential to educate ourselves on it because like our literal job is talking about. So, of course, that I like went and pursued further education in that space, but I would say, yeah, that's pretty much the way we're trained is just to talk about screening and surgeries. And so, I remember kind of feeling like really unfulfilled about that at the hospital because I would have patients ask me too. They were like, well, I've heard microwavable meals are bad, but that's all I eat. And I felt like I had like duct tape on my mouth,
Ugh, I
and
know
I
it's so hard to not like say like, yeah, it's probably bad for you.
yeah, yeah. So, that was like a huge, I think, I mean, a huge reason I left is I was like, there's so much more I can do for these patients. And it was actually really like breaking my heart seeing patients pass away and then their family members coming in and then me telling them they're at increased risk of the same cancer their parent just passed away from and not telling them more than just get mammograms,
Yeah.
so
Oh yeah, of course.
like,
Because it's
yeah.
like they're living their life day to day with this like looming thing over them, like, oh, my parent died of this, and now I'm at risk for it.
Yeah.
The end. Like, what? That's like
Yeah.
such a
Yeah.
terrifying, scary reality to live in when you don't have that empowerment of like, no, you can actually take matters into your own hands and do this, this, and this, and this, and it will totally change your outcome.
Exactly. That's how I feel too. And I think also the other thing is like I was working in cancer and Alzheimer's, which we know are, like conditions that the outside world impacts so much. I mean, it's just silly to me when people argue that when we have so much research about how diet, exercise, brain games, walking, like all of these activities impact risk. And so it's like because I think it was like a blessing in disguise that I ended up in those specialties because I was like, okay, well, these are conditions where we have a lot of control on our risk. And of course, like, with genetics and being high risk, I feel like it was even more essential. So,
Yeah,
anyways,
no, 100%.
yeah.
Okay, so my brain is like pinging at me because I had a question around when we were starting to talk about like dopamine and like the psych genetics and with the other types of genetics where you test like the inflammatory pathways and the detox pathways. Um, I'm totally fine if we use my genetics as an example, but I'm just curious, like if let's say I had a dopamine pathway that I don't know what the word you would use to describe it, but was maybe like less sufficient. Like I wasn't
Yeah.
producing enough dopamine. Then we could
Yeah.
look at the detox factors or the inflammatory factors and be like, well, these are working okay, which helps balance the dopamine. Or like, how would you put the puzzle pieces together to create a picture for somebody if you were reading their genes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, dopamine balance. So, yeah, like you said, we know that a lot of pathways interact with each other. So, like the inflammatory pathway is going to interact with our mood and behavior pathway.
Hmm.
So, or detoxification. So, first, I'll look at your cellular pathways. So, for you, I feel like do you mind me talking about your
Yeah, no,
results?
no, you're good. Go for it. We'll put it out there.
Okay. Like what came up mostly for you was detox and oxidative stress. And so supporting detox and oxidative stress are doing things like, again, like we talked about, supporting our detox pathway. Because so like bringing it full circle quickly, if our body can't eliminate toxins, chemicals, mold, we will be in more of an inflamed state anyways. So even though your genetics on inflammation looked good, we know that again how they're all related. If you have like these outside environmental, chemicals, toxins, things impacting your inflammation, and then we know chronic inflammation can lead to neurotransmitter disruption. And then on top of that, because you had some dopamine stuff, it's we want to make sure we get the inflammation, the detox, and the oxidative stress down. And
Right.
then for dopamine specifically, I always like to talk about too, like how can you actually balance dopamine from like a cognitive perspective, which I think is something you have a lot more knowledge on. But I think it's really interesting to okay, what is dopamine? Like dopamine is quick pleasures, and oftentimes what I see with patients who have dopamine stuff is they may have like more cravings, or it can sometimes lead to anxiety, and then they feel like they have to explode and have an outlet. And so it can be helpful to also think about like how can you incorporate little things that bring you joy throughout your day, or creative hobbies. That I always say, like, there was this trend about the dopamine journal, but I literally say write a dopamine journal for yourself where it's like little things that bring you joy, like even aesthetic drinks or putting your face in the sun, and then incorporating that throughout the day. So
Mm-hmm.
like just balancing that
Mm-hmm. I
that
love
way too.
that. Well, and just on a general level, I feel like not everybody, but a lot of people have a hard time even connecting to their joy or thinking about things that bring them joy. And
Yeah.
like, I think that it's not crazy. I don't want to use that word, but it's like it detaches us from our humanity. And then all of these other pathways, genetically and
Yeah.
energetically, whatever, they all just kind of get imbalanced. And then we're having our symptoms of
Mhm.
anxiety or panic attacks or depression or lack of motivation or whatever it is, and then that's leading to physical disease where we have the manifestation of autoimmune disorders or Hashimoto's, Graves' disease, like all those different things. Those are pretty extreme, but our thyroid, our pituitary gland, our hypothalamus, our adrenals, all of those organs get impacted by these genes and by the environment and our mental emotional, and like everything is connected. So
Yeah.
just
Exactly.
having that kind of information, I think that's what was so amazing for me when I had this session with you and I learned about it. I was like, oh my gosh, these are all so connected. And when I'm focusing on my detox pathways, that can help balance the dopamine. And I don't need to have, an exogenous type of or
Yeah.
like taking dopamine exogenously or taking something like an SSRI to balance my neurotransmitters. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, even like sugar, alcohol, like all of a lot of people, I think reach for those things to try, to get the
Hmm.
dopamine exogenously. So,
Totally.
yeah, I feel like another thing, just like so, I mean, obviously, you're amazing in this. And like, I think it's just, even when we're talking about cancer risk, it's like we really need to talk about your, like mental state. It's
Mm.
just, I think that's like a lot of a big missing piece too in when we're talking, because people, I've had patients that are doing all the right things, and they're like, I have like a perfect home environment, I eat perfectly, like all these things, and I'm like, okay, how's your stress level? And they're like freaking out about being perfect. And I'm like, that's not the goal. So
Right.
yeah, just like mental state, like so important too, like you said, just in cascade. So
Hmm.
just acknowledging that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's so
More people to go
important.
to you. Like basically more people need to go to you.
Well, they need both of us because
Yeah.
they're both
Yeah.
so important to know. Like, I think
Yeah.
that I only had one risk factor come up for, was it cystic fibrosis?
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
like my risk factor, but I didn't have really anything else, which I'm really grateful for. But I
Yeah.
did have some of the, dopamine pathway issues. And I'm a person who I don't drink alcohol. I can barely tolerate sugar. Like I've
Yeah.
learned those things through my life experience, but then when we tested my genetics, it validated all of that for me that like I should be avoiding those things for my
Yeah.
genetic health. I was like, oh, this is amazing.
Yeah, no, I think that's what's so fun about just like I think, people think like genetics is such an abstract thing, but when you're really thinking about like what that's what I like obviously nerd on this, but when I look at my food, I'm like, oh, look at all the things that are gonna turn on or off my pathways.
That's amazing. I love
So
that.
it's
So
so
like
fun.
like what would chicken turn on or off? How would that impact you if you ate chicken?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, glucose and insulin is another big pathway that we talk about.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Glucose and insulin's genetics is also so controlled by our expression. Those genes in general, even appetite genes, So, I think that's such an interesting one, like how protein can turn on or off the leptin or ghrelin genes. So I
Mhm.
think, that's always fascinating too, because some people do have high risk of obesity, but we also need to recognize like how much power we have with food over those genes.
Right.
So, that's always like really interesting too, like how we stabilize our blood sugar.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's just this like theme surfacing for me that using this data to empower you versus victimize you and
Yeah,
to educate you so that you can make wise decisions about things that you do and do not do. Like
exactly.
luckily, I'm a person who, in my life, and because maybe it's because I'm a highly sensitive person, it's my dopamine or my neurotransmitters that made me realize that I can't do alcohol because I feel like crap afterwards and none of it
Yeah.
really goes very well. And then my detox doesn't work well. So it's like, not
Yeah.
only does that feel very validating because through my life experience, I already knew that, but if I were to have been a person who didn't know that and wasn't really into like all this holistic health and did the
Yeah.
work that I did, I wouldn't have known that. And I could have just gone through my whole life feeling miserable and just bogged down and not living into my highest potential and on my highest path. Like, I feel like that's what you're really doing is you're opening these doors for people to have power and to walk down their path to truly embody their highest and truest self from like the
Yeah.
tiniest little levels of our genetics to like the full expression of their beingness.
Yeah. Oh, that was amazing. I have that
I'm
on my
like,
website.
wow, that's amazing.
But it's so true. No, I love that because yeah, I feel like when people first come to me, they're very apprehensive and they're like, I don't know if I want to know this information, and I think maybe that comes from also society's portrayal of genetics
Yeah.
and
Well, because they're victimizing you with it and they're scaring you with it and they don't have
yeah,
any answers for you, like the
yeah,
mainstream of
yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's like if you look at news titles, it's like the worst for genetics. It's like she thought out she was doomed. And I'm like, oh my God.
I know the freaking like they're trying to do that 3 second hook and it's like, stop it. You're
Yeah,
just hurting people.
yeah, 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 I know, right? Fear mongering. So, but
Hmm.
I think that's like so amazing. Yeah, I really feel like the way that I view genetics is like just, yeah, very, I want to say light, but that's not the word. It's like in like I feel like you're good at when I'm saying this stuff. You get what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah, no,
But
I
in this like
definitely
kind
do.
of yeah, like higher energy state. So I really like want to like pass that on to patients. So I feel like at first patients are like scared, and then when we work together, like, oh my God, I'm so glad I did this because it's like totally different than I think people realize. It's really about like understanding, yourself, feeling validated, and then feeling empowered on like what to do. And so I think, yeah, you described it perfectly,
Yeah, it
but
gives them a good roadmap. And
yeah.
in a lot of ways, I feel like if people aren't already on the path to like getting rid of toxins and I'm, filtering my water and I'm eating healthy and I'm cooking in stainless steel, not Teflon, and
Yeah.
they recognize some of these things, then it provides them a lot of validation and then further steps to be like, oh yeah, I know I need to do this or not do this. And then for the type of
Yeah.
person who doesn't know any of those things, you're like saving their life because you're telling them how they could make decisions. You're not telling them what to do, but you're empowering them with like, hey, if you did this, this, and this, you'd be setting yourself up for a lot more success and health and wellness and great experiences in life so that you're not always bogged down with illness and heaviness and, these symptoms that are unexplainable or that you could have prevented before, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it's really empowering too for people to see it actually on like I'm like, they're like, oh, now I understand like my phase two detox pathway and glutathione conjugation is
Yes.
not working well. And so I like, even though that's so specific, people are like, oh, like now I understand why taking glutathione is good for me. And I think, there's so much and it's really interesting to see like for them and like why their genetics is empowering, instead of just like like you were saying, it's I think people maybe have a tougher time habit changing because they can't conceptualize what it's doing to their body
Hmm.
or how it's going through their body,
Right.
because like So yeah, being able to like see like, oh, this is like my DNA that I was like literally born with, and this is how it's processing the outside world, can be
Yes.
like really like fascinating and empowering.
Yes. Oh, I love it. So cool. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. There's literally so many more. Like I want to continue going for hours and hours and hours, but aside from all of the tips we've already talked about and all of the amazing little nuggets we've given people, is there anything else that you want to share with people, like to support them or to give them insight?
Yeah, I feel like we covered so much.
We
I'm
did.
like,
I mean, I feel like we covered everything that I wanted to know for now in my head.
yeah,
So, um,
yeah,
I love that. So if there's anything else that comes to mind, let me know.
yeah,
But otherwise, I think if I were to sum up like the biggest message here, it's that if you have a condition, get your genetics tested. You can see and feel validated if you have a risk factor like that patient that you mentioned, and it can help you know the other things to do to support you. If you don't have any risk factors, you're a young person, like, whatever, you're just kind of trudging through your life, or you're just curious, get your genetics tested. It can help you in so many different ways, can help let you know that you should be doing this or shouldn't be doing that, just like what we've talked about with me in my case, and really set you up for a much better life, in my opinion. So
yeah,
I'm like, go get your genetics. I tell everyone, I'm
yeah.
like, you gotta
Plug for
go get your genetics tested.
I love it. No, it's so true. Yeah, a lot of people will say like, "Oh, I'm healthy," or "I don't have anything. Like, should I do my genetics?" And I always say the earlier the better because the goal of it is actually like I was saying is like we don't want to be reactive. We want to be proactive. We don't want to just do your genetics when something already came up. So
Right.
I actually feel like I always tell patients, like, actually, of course, we'll talk about this with you and the benefits and limitations for you, specifically at your age. But I always say, like, in a perfect world, this would be just part of standard care because it allows us to have literal personalized care.
Yeah,
And again, like, be proactive, be precise, preventative, like all these things that we want to be. So, but yeah, I will mention too, there's a lot of genetic tests out there. Well, on that note, be aware that not all genetic tests are created equal. So, we definitely work with what genetic tests would be best for you. And then also we can choose like what you do and don't want to know. So, I also understand and validate people's opinions on knowing certain things. And like, that's what the beauty of genetic testing is though, is we can actually talk through like, well, what information would be best for you to know right now. So
totally.
that's so
Yeah, so
important
you can
too.
kind of pick and choose and like choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, I know that we're wrapping up here, but quick question. I'm sure that this might be coming up in people's minds. What about like the 23andMe test? I feel like that's what most people have been exposed to genetics through. What's your opinion about
Yeah.
that?
I know it's so fascinating because the world of genetic testing blew up, especially because of the ancestry test. So, 23andMe and Ancestry are like tests that are okay to do for ancestry. I do not recommend them for health. So, a couple reasons is one, they're using a different technology than some of the other genetic tests that we do use. So, they're not going to pick up on everything. They're also usually picking only specific genes that they look at, which is, in my opinion, not comprehensive. So, like we test for like 200 plus genes. Oftentimes, 23andMe Health Insights are like 4 genes, and they're only looking at like specific changes in those genes. So it's just not something I recommend for health insights. I also, last thing on that is it's really important to also have someone who understands genetics to help you interpret your results.
Mm.
Otherwise, you're basically getting a book that you can't understand. And
Right.
so I always say, like, I help translate that book for you. And if you're missing that translation piece, unfortunately, you can have a lot of misinformation from Dr. Google or another person who's not trained in genetics, giving you false information about that. So just outside of that too, I would say like when you're considering doing genetic testing for health reasons outside of ancestry, to not just order an online genetic test like 23andMe, or even like there's some that are coming out that look for just methylation genes, for instance. Like I would not do those tests. I would see someone, like me, plug,
Yes, because
who can
Nat is
help.
amazing.
But someone who can like help you determine what tests to order and why, and then
Yeah.
how to interpret.
That makes sense. Yeah. I feel like in our society, there's such I want to do it myself and I don't need anyone's help. And like, I'm
Yeah.
this, that. And it's like, yeah, that's going to get you a little ways, but it's not comprehensive. It's not going
Yeah.
to probably
It's
interpret for you
way
what you
more.
need.
Yeah, and I think too that companies are becoming really good at marketing too, so they're like pushing people to do that. They're like, you can do it all on your own.
Yeah.
But I see patients all the time who they left more confused than before, and then they're like, can you interpret this for me? I'm confused. So it's
Hmm.
not, it's yeah, I don't, genetics is one of it's just, it's like another healthcare tests like blood test panels. There's things you can notice, but it really can take a specialist to find patterns and figure
Right.
out what's showing up in your blood tests. It's similar to
Yeah,
DNA.
totally. Okay. So if somebody did want to work with you, what would be the best way for them to take the next step?
Yeah, so definitely, I like definitely don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. You can email me at natalie@goldengeneticshealth.com if you have further questions. You can also visit my website, www.goldengeneticshealth.com. And then also my Instagram is Golden Genetics Health.
Perfect.
And you can
Streamlined and
DM.
easy.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, this has been so informative, so amazing. You're amazing. I love what you're doing in the world. I know we didn't really get much into like your history or your story about like going off the beaten path, but I think it's kind of clear through our discussion that you are such a holistically minded, integratively minded practitioner and really treat and see a whole person in front of you, not just letters and numbers and stats and research and all of that. Like and I know you very, very personally, so like you have such an amazing gift and way of supporting people and feeling empathically into people, and like we talked about, really empowering them on their path. So I just want your message to be spread as far and wide as possible, and thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, well, everything you said right back at you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. All right, until next time. If you love this episode and or maybe others that you've listened to, please leave a review wherever you're listening to this. Share it with somebody that you think it could help. That's the biggest way you can help me help even more people like us. And if you want one-on-one support, feel free to go to findinghomehealing.com and schedule an intro session with me there. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you in the next one.